So no, I appreciate the time and I appreciate the invite. This actually was a kind of an edited down version of a presentation I had put together not too long ago for another group of engineers that I was working with. Of course, um, in my day job, I work with 4,000 electrical and control system engineers, and this was kind of my overall approach of how folks from the engineering or then just the general like control systems, automation, even telecom in the automation world, right? How they can move into or learn more about cybersecurity and control system environments. So, of course, at the day job, always talk about control systems out in out in the outside world. We talk OT, ICS. So you'll catch me going between the terms pretty often. So and then we're just going to jump right into it. But for those of you that don't know me, I'm the fellow for cybersecurity at Fluor. I think most nice thing about talking with folks, especially in the engineering community, they usually know Fluor, and I don't have to explain what it is we do. But we are one of the larger global engineering corporation companies. We build and design some of the world's largest control system environments. I was really excited to see my largest project, the $50 billion LNG port facility for Shell up in Canada. And now Canada is exporting their first LNG ever, which is really exciting to see. But that was a $50 billion project, right? When you think of the size and scope and scale of that monstrosity. So, but it's really exciting to see that launch. So I also run a couple of cybersecurity conferences. I run B-Sides Greenville here locally in Greenville, South Carolina. And then we have B-Sides ICS now, which we run the day before S4, which is it's like the big granddaddy ICS cybersecurity conference every year in Miami. And then we actually have some folks that are starting to spin up them elsewhere. So next year we already have Singapore and Belgium that are spinning up, and then we've been talking to folks like London, Mexico City, and Bangalore, and a couple other places. So I'm really excited about that. So, ton of certifications. If there is a commonly accepted OT or control system cybersecurity certification, I have it. So I'm working actually on my CAP right now through ISA. And then, but I do, as you mentioned, post a lot on LinkedIn and YouTube around OT, ICS, cybersecurity. So this to me. So if we're not connected on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out, and you can always find me there. So, yeah, and I mentioned when you're putting the workshop together is really, how do folks from the automation or engineering worlds, make that transition into cybersecurity for control systems or for ICS. And if anything, it'll give you an idea of whether that's something that you want to do or if it's something that you need to do, and then give you a path and how to do that. When I first started to try to get into control system cybersecurity, of course, I come from an IT background and doing IT cybersecurity for 30 plus years. But when Stuxnet came out in 2010, that was really where I got curious, and I got really lucky getting the job at Fluor a little over a year after that, and then being able to start to make that transition. So I do have a couple of free ebooks. So the purple one is actually written for folks from an OT or automation engineering background. And that's pretty much what we're going to walk through in this section. What those books look like is really the top 10 things that I always suggest people to make that transition or learn at least more about OT or ICS cybersecurity. And when you come from an engineering background, you might not have like the strongest understanding of things. Like IT networking, right? And IP addressing and subnetting and routing and all those fun things. But those are absolutely essential to understanding how cybersecurity works in environments, because where we're integrating with TCP/IP, right, and so on. So that's really what we're going to walk through. Before we get to those, I did want to take at least a few minutes though, kind of set the stage and the understanding of why we even need to be concerned about control system cybersecurity. And there was a refinery explosion here in the United States, which could potentially have been the result of a cyber attack. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more in detail in a moment. But steadily since, especially the Colonial Pipeline breach that we had 4 years ago in the United States. So, how many are you familiar with the Colonial Pipeline incident? But this is where we had the largest gasoline pipeline in the United States, and it would go down for 10 days. And what had happened was a group of ransomware operators, right? They are solely out to break into your environments and infect it to make money, right? And so they had broken into the Colonial Pipeline back offices. Now, they didn't realize, right? They ran the countries in the United States' largest gasoline pipeline. They just saw it as another target, right? And they were just breaking in another kind of IT environment, try to get in, like smash and grab, right? Infect the systems and say, pay us money and we'll go away. And what ended up happening was they got in the environment, installed ransomware, it started to spread. And then, of course, there was the impact to the OT, or the control systems network, and that the pipeline was taken down out of an abundance of caution. And there was probably a little bit more going on there. But of course, unless we were there, nobody knows, exactly what was going on. I do have a couple of friends that were working response, so I think there was a lot more going on there. So, but since Colonial Pipeline, right, again, and this was only 4 years ago, prior to that, we only worried mostly, right, about state adversaries breaking into our environments, right? So Russia, China, the United States, right, coming in, breaking into our environments, whether either stealing information or prepositioning themselves to one day where they could impact the control system environment or the actual process, right? So sometimes we talk about, are they in a position to make themselves go boom, right? Or it's very common for military leadership to want to take down the power plant because that power plant is responsible for providing power to a military base, in an enemy country. That's a very common scenario. But they also forget at the same time that the power plant that supplies electricity to that military installation also supplies electricity to hundreds, if not millions of people. And so there's always that line, that do we cross as from a military perspective, and how do we impact, civilian infrastructure, right? And those lines are definitely blurring more and more, right? And we see all the conflicts that we have, especially in Russia and Ukraine, which is a very hotbed for cyber activity, and Iran and Israel as well. So the number of attacks, though, is only increasing year after year, and we're talking about doubling, tripling, quadrupling, not just a 5-10% increase. Right. Again, it's not state adversaries just coming after our environments. After Colonial Pipeline, all of the ransomware groups and the hacktivists out there, they realized that they could target control system networks. And if they could impact them, that they could get paid even faster. Right. If I have, let's say, a refinery and that refinery goes down and I'm losing even a small number, like $10 million a day, and the ransomware operators are asking for $5 million. Yeah, we're probably going to pay them $5 million to go away so we can get back up and running. So we can start generating and start making money again. Part of the problem is that over the last, especially 10 years, right, we've seen IT OT conversions, or really this idea, right, that we have so much communication that happens between IT and the control systems or the OT network. And as that's also taking place, right, we've seen this massive influx of Windows systems and other kind of traditional IT-based systems or operating systems like Linux move into OT networks. So it makes it very easy for attackers to get into not only the IT environment, to move into the OT network. Now, once they hit a DCS or PLC or an HMI, they kind of have to stop, right? Because they don't really know typically what they're doing, right? They don't have the control systems skill set. Most don't, right? They're only impacting Windows systems. But that's also changing. Of course, state adversaries, those groups, they have that control system knowledge. And now we are seeing ransomware operators, hacktivists, and others. They're like a lot of the world right now. They're growing that control system knowledge that they need to be able to control and impact our OT networks. So I put this slide together to kind of demonstrate over time this idea of, before Colonial Pipeline in 2021, again, just 4 years ago, we would have a significant OT incident every year or so, right? So when I started getting into control system cybersecurity, it was 2010 because of Stuxnet. And I'm like, this was really fascinating. I was just, completely just obsessed, right? And then we start learning more about control system environments and just control systems, and then it was just like, but nothing else was happening, right? There weren't any real attacks that anybody was talking about, and that was very different, right, than the IT world. Because in the IT world, we have attacks in the news every single day, and significant attacks in the news every single day. And that just wasn't how it was in the control system world. And part of this, yes, there were attacks that weren't being talked about, right? A lot of this was done at the state adversary level, and a lot of it was kept very hush hush. Sure, I've heard some great stories, right? But overall, still, right, there's very few actual attacks, especially attacks that have an impact on a process in a control system environment. When Russia had created a blackout in the Ukraine for the first time in 2015, right? Hundreds of thousands of people without power for about 8 hours in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter, right? Sub-zero temperatures outside. Everybody thought that was going to be the news event, right? That really woke up everybody, right? Because once an attacker brought down, either the grid or at least caused a blackout in a city, right? That would be it. That's all we needed to get people to wake up to the need for control system cybersecurity, and that didn't happen. The Russians went in and did the same thing to the Ukrainians a year later in 2016, and nothing changed. Right now in 2017, we also thought, oh, well, the Trice incident was going to make things change. And this is where the Russians, same group that caused the Ukrainian blackouts, went into a petrochemical facility run by Saudi Aramco in the Middle East and took over the entire OT network, including SIS. So they had full control. I should say they had 99.999% control over the SIS. But they made one small coding error, which caused the SIS to trip. And of course, they called in the vendor. Vendor said, hey, this is not a Schneider, so it's the Triconix controllers. They brought in outside help to understand, oh, yeah, this is actually somebody had got to the controller and replaced the firmware with their own. And they were pre-positioning themselves to do very, very bad things. And Rob Lee, who runs Dragos, if you're not familiar, Dragos is the kind of the world leading firm for control system cybersecurity. Rob Lee focused on there are easily at least 12 different ways to kill people in that environment. And then there was a gentleman on his team, Reed, great guy, got to talk to him last year. He actually found the programming issue in that compromised firmware and fixed it in about 5 minutes. So, and then he had also actually reprogrammed it so it would work for facilities in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot of concern there. Fortunately, right, I should say that we haven't had a significant issue happen to where people have to pay attention, but it's kind of where we're going. I did mention there was that explosion at a petrochemical facility here in the United States, and it could potentially have been a cyber attack. So Rob Lee, I mentioned, so they track a lot of activity with control system attacks. They were actually tracking the same TriSys, the group that was responsible for TriSys. The group is called Sandworm. And so they're actually watching the Sandworm group trying to get into this one environment over and over and over again for 6 weeks. And then there was an explosion at the plant. And the owners had released a statement that said the explosion was due to the safety controllers tripping, which was a very eerie, similar, situation to TriSys. Now, the problem is in that environment, they had no security monitoring. There was no logging. So when the owners came back and said, well, there was no sign of cyber attack, like, you don't know if it was a cyber attack or not because you weren't watching, right? So without network security monitoring, which most environments don't have, that you wouldn't know. So we don't know, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility that that could have been the result of a cyber attack. But the point they're kind of getting to, and why I wanted to put this slide together, was really, you can see since Colonial Pipeline, right, there's been a huge shift in the number of attacks and big, name attacks as well, that we're at this point where this is where we're headed. And where we're at in 2025, we're not ready. I mentioned Rob, I talk about Rob a lot, but Rob, I remember the first time I think I listened to him, and probably was like 2010, 2011. He was always the person, always has been, that would always say, don't listen to the fear, don't listen to, the uncertainty and the doubt, right? We've got this handled, right? We're taking care of business, we're working through it. And now if you listen to him today, he will tell you, we are not ready. The time to get prepared, that was 5 years ago. We're not ready for what's coming. And we're already starting to see, because the attackers are going after every critical infrastructure, right, sector that's out there. This is most of them, at least defined by the United States. And I have projects in almost all of these areas. I just don't do a lot of like water and maritime. Some. But attackers are coming after all of these environments, in particularly manufacturing, right? Manufacturing is getting hit, and they're getting hit hard because, there's manufacturing everywhere, and they almost never have any security. I also do consulting on the side. And so I was just working with one of the country's largest auto part manufacturers. And they have 100 plus plants across North America, very little cybersecurity. And just talking with them, it's like, they had an issue like 6 months ago that affected production at some of their plants. And I knew about that. I was like, that obviously is bad. We want to prevent that from happening again. But then they also got into, there was another incident at another plant like 2 months before that. And there was another incident at a bunch of plants, 2 months before that. And they just kept going on and on and on. And it was crazy. and still had to sell leadership on the fact that, yeah, they probably should start doing something about OT cybersecurity. I finally just told the guy, I was like, if you don't make this change, you're just going to continue to have these problems. Through the end, you decide. It's a little frustrating, as you can imagine. But a lot of owners and operators still don't see themselves as targets, even though every OT environment is actively targeted these days. It's just it's just like in the IT world. It's just a matter of when they get to you, right? When we start looking at OT, right? Whatever that environment, what does it produce, right? Can the world live without it, right? At Floor, yeah, I get to work in some of the world's largest power stations, but also we build the world's largest pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities, right? What happens when the world's largest insulin manufacturer goes down for 10 days? That's a huge impact. Or yeah, there's a lot of people potentially that could not only get sick but could die because of that impact. Right? So a lot of us are really here for the mission, right? To make sure everybody stays safe, right? Keep the world safe. Now, before I get into the top 10, and it's really kind of the last half hour, but I did want to talk about real quickly the main ways that attackers get into a control system network. So in this case, we have a power plant. And what Midjourney thinks is a power plant, but we'll go with it. So the majority of attacks, right, will still come through IT. Right? We talk about right that we have all those connections between IT and OT these days, and in most environments, for better or for worse, right? So we have a lot of attackers moving from IT into OT, just like in Colonial Pipeline, just in Trisis, and just like all of these other incidents. Of course, we talk about transitory cyber assets, right? Our fancy way of saying systems that we move in and out of the environment. So laptops, USB drives, smartphones. I can't tell you, the last time I didn't go into a plant and see a smartphone, right, on a cable connected to an engineering workstation because it was charging, right? But is that phone safe? That, let alone that that phone has that 5G connection straight out to the internet. Like, yeah, we don't want these in the environment. I've even been in clean rooms that I like, how, it's just amazing. Plants, these days we have internet connectivity, right? Cloud activity, right? That usually we're sending data out and allowing it to be crunched in maybe some cloud computing center to do things like predictive analytics. The problem is a lot of environments have also poor security controls that are allowing not only attackers to get in, but to control the environment, access the environment from over the internet. And that should just be one thing that should not happen if we've done even just the basic fundamentals of cyber well. And we're going to talk about those as we wrap up. Disgruntled insiders, to me, this is even worse in IT, because in the IT world, sure, somebody can maybe take down the systems as they go out the door. But when you think, what if I had an engineer that understood the process in the plant? They actually understood what an attacker could do and how to impact the process to have some type of high impact event like an explosion, or to result in that plant coming down for days, if not weeks or months, or maybe never coming back online. Supply chain, right? So we bring in equipment, right? Hardware and software that could be compromised. We have Wi-Fi, right? So we have a lot of wireless and RF communication inside our plants these days. Even things like Bluetooth, right? You're sitting there on you have technicians using their phone to connect to a device over Bluetooth, right? And Bluetooth can be impacted from over a mile away, even though we only think of it in terms of maybe a dozen feet or so. Is your Wi-Fi network secure, right? And there are other ways, let alone just somebody showing up on site and walking right in. I've done that in different plants as well. There's a lot there, right, that we're trying to protect against. So in particularly if OT cybersecurity or control system cybersecurity is new to you, right? Really, the last part of the presentation talks about how you can learn more, how you can get more experience, and then we'll talk a little bit also about how the kind of the basic fundamentals of protecting control system environments. So I'm going to go through these 10 steps really pretty quickly, so that way we can also get to talk to about how do we secure our environments. So the first one, and I started to touch on this earlier, right? A lot of folks from the engineering side, right, just don't have that foundation in IT networking and IT cyber attacks. When you think about that, the vast majority of attacks that we have in OT environments, they realistically, they're just IT cybersecurity attacks, right? They're not getting into the environment and, manipulating an HMI or PLC or DCS to have some type of impact on the process. They're just impacting the Windows systems in the control system network, right? So it's still, though, we need a good understanding of how networking and IT cybersecurity takes place. Now, I also talk about, when we look at the differences between IT cybersecurity and OT cybersecurity, there are a lot of people, especially from the engineering side, and I have a lot of great friends, a lot of people I respect, from that background. But when some of them say IT cybersecurity and OT cybersecurity are nothing alike, I get a little crazy. Because IT cybersecurity and OT cybersecurity, they actually have more in common than they don't. So to say they're nothing alike is it's just wrong. They actually have a lot more in common than not. What's key is understanding where they're different and how they're different. So things like vulnerability management, right? Yeah, that's very different between IT and OT. And yeah, I would have been the guy. I was the guy 12 years ago that when I went into the first power station, right, 1800 megawatt, it was a combined cycle plant. Yeah, I would have been the guy that said, oh yeah, just, update the firmware on all the PLCs and reboot them, and right, because that was the mindset I came from. So I get it, right? So it is important to understand where they're different, how they're different, right? So yeah, we don't kill people and we don't bring down the plant. But again, they are much more alike than they're not. Right? So, and so just a couple of topics to think about, right? And I always suggest people, the quickest way to learn networking, if you don't have like a basic familiarity, is CompTIA Network Plus. They have a certification called Network Plus, right? It's great for covering the basics. I have a lot of engineers, they'll actually go and want to do their CCNA, right? The Cisco Certified Network Administrator, which is, if you work in a large plant and it's all Cisco gear, and that's what you want to support, great, knock yourself out. But you don't have to typically go to that length, right? You can just focus on the basics, right? IP addressing, subnetting, routing, switching, right? Wi-Fi, you get the idea, right? And talk about especially spending time in understanding firewalls and how they work, right? Or here I have the dumpster fire, right? Because a lot of firewalls in control system environments are not configured securely. Unfortunately, even today in 2025. So, and if they even exist at all. So I actually walked into one of the world's largest power stations, and the plant manager was really excited to show me their brand new firewalls, and took me in, to the kind of right off the data center, opened up the cabinet, and showed me his Cisco Catalyst appliances. And I was like, those aren't firewalls. Those are switches. So we actually had to get that fixed pretty quickly, right? Because switches can, yes, have some basic security functionality like access control list, but so, all right. So number two is, once you understand, the fundamentals of IT networking and cybersecurity, then we can start looking at, okay, how do we apply this in the OT world, right? And this, I think, is really where it's great for engineers to learn this information. Because if you're coming from the engineering world and understand how plants are designed and built and how the physics of that particular environment work, right? Because every environment's different. Even, power plant to power plant is very different. But understanding how we can apply, because a lot of people, right, if they're coming from IT, right, they think in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, where, right, in the control system world, it's safety is always number one. And then we're always concerned with making sure the plant stays up and running. So we're talking about availability or reliability, or I always talk about resilience. I want to be in a position like where I'm not Colonial Pipeline. If the IT network burns down, honestly, I don't care if it doesn't impact safety and keeping the plant up and running, right? I want to make sure the plant stays up and running and everybody stays safe if IT burns down. And I don't care, as long as, yep, we're safe and we're up and running. And that's how our environments should be designed. They're just not, unfortunately. So, and then performance, right? Because if we're up and running, are we actually running under optimal conditions? So that's a big difference, right? So if you're looking for training options, and then we'll also talk about certifications near the end, because I leave that last, right? Certifications are great, but what we really want is the knowledge, right, to be able to put into action. So there's free training, really two places that people go, and this might seem a little self-serving, but people will either go to CISA or CISA, CISA, which is a U.S. government entity that's created a lot of training, mostly by engineers. Some of it's a little dry, but it's free and it's high quality. I also have a bunch of different courses on YouTube. So I have my first course for getting started in ICS or OT cybersecurity. It's 25 plus hours. Some of that's probably dry too, but we try to get the basics that people need to understand how to secure environments. It's the class I wish I had when I first got into control system cybersecurity. So, and actually the new version of this is going to launch in probably October. So I'm excited about that. So, and this is what the current version looks like. So you can see there's 11 different parts. The last one actually just covers the review questions. Right? There's like over 200 review questions now. Part 10 is pen testing, right? How do attackers break into OT environments and so on. There's incident response, vulnerability management, building asset registers. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I'm also a big fan of podcasts, so I can listen while I'm in the car or while I'm walking in the mornings, and I can learn so much by listening to others. And that's why I love control systems, because whether I'm listening to an engineer or whether I'm talking about someone doing OT cybersecurity, right? It's in IT, it's kind of everything's cookie cutter, right? Everything is the same, right? Pretty much from environment to environment. It's very different, right, in the control systems world, right? Because again, it's I can listen to somebody talking about running operations and cyber in a power plant versus like an open face mine, versus a petrochemical facility versus a railway, right? And you always learn. I always talk about, like, I don't learn, a new thing a day. I learn multiple new things every day, right? And I've been doing that for over 10 years at this point, right? But here are some great podcasts that are out there to listen to. So I would say Industrial Security Podcast and the CSA podcast are probably the two to start with. And they have probably the most guests and kind of across the entire field. So you get a little bit of everything. So we're just going to jump to this one. So next step is to look at the standards that are out there. Now, pretty much we have NIST 882 and 62443. It's kind of interesting. I've actually been asked by both groups to help, kind of work on the next version, which is really exciting. I think 882 goes under the radar a lot because it's based out of the U.S. It's sponsored by the United States government, right? There's not any international traction, but it's a great, free resource. I think they do a really good job. They just don't have that international traction, right? So if you're in the US, Canada, right, people will talk about it, but really everybody still looks to 60443 as the gold standard for securing control system environments, right? It's written by engineers, right? For engineers. I actually have a bunch of friends now that were on the original committees and still work on the updates for it, and it gets a little convoluted at times. So I try to read it and my eyes cross over and they're like, yeah, ours too. So my new class that I have on YouTube right now, I've just released part 2, is all about implementing 62443, but trying to break it down and make it a little bit more simple and practical, which is not what the standards do, right? And the standards aren't free. You have to purchase them, or you have to be an ISA member to be able to access them, right? So it's another kind of, I have a hard time with that, right? To make somebody pay for the standards. So always talk about folks getting hands-on experience, right? This is much more difficult, I think, for folks coming from the IT world. Like for me, I remember getting my first PLC and I was super excited, and it showed up and I'm like, where do I put the power cord? Right? It's like, oh, right, it's a whole different world, right? So when you're coming from, working with engineers at the office, it's very different, because somebody would be like, oh yeah, I went home and I put this system in to control my sprinklers in the yard, and then but added a web interface, and then I've added a control system. I mean, it just goes on and on, right? It's very, very different, but there are a lot of great resources out there for gaining hands-on experience. There's actually a new virtual environment called LabShock that somebody had put together, Zachar Bernhardt, I shouldn't say somebody, put together, and it simulates, I think, a petrochemical facility. I haven't been able to play with it yet. That's my weekend goal. So don't tell my girlfriend, but so check out LabShock. Just Google it so if you want a virtual environment to play with. I do talk about, and I always stress, the need for community and control system cybersecurity, right? And whether it's different associations, like the main association out there is CSA. So it's mostly a lot of folks like you would see in ISA, right, from the engineering world, owners, operators, that are, I think they have 40,000 members, globally. It's the one place. It's run by Derek Harp. He's definitely a friend, and a lot of great folks in the group. And they put on a lot of the podcasts, and they do webinars every week, and a lot of great folks out there. There's the ISACs, right, for different industries. So a lot of great information sharing that goes on within those groups, again, particular to those industries. I'm kind of, my role at Floor, we design and build, we don't operate. So these are typically built for folks doing operations and maybe like O&M work. So I don't get to join any of these. I just get to hear stories. So a lot of interesting stories. I'm big proponent for conferences, bringing people together. I said we started besides ICS this year. We're in Miami next year, so really excited. We'll have about 500 folks. Again, S4, it's like the biggest conference in the OT cyberspace. Level Zero had started this year. That's an Atlanta-based conference focused on engineers in cybersecurity. So that was actually started by the CSA folks, and I helped out with that. We just had the SANS ICS Summit in Orlando a couple weeks ago, which was great. A lot of that's a great group because it's just like it's engineers, it's owners and operators. It's you get researchers from like Idaho National Labs and a lot of the other big players and IT cybersecurity folks, and you just get everybody from every walk of life, which is really awesome. ICS Village, and there's a show in Atlanta later in the year as well from Cybersecurity Week. I do have a couple of the resources out there. I'm a huge fan now of LinkedIn. When I started posting, it was just to get educational information out there. I didn't even realize like how many OT folks were out there, that let alone when people start posting or like commenting on your post, you can learn so much. I've also learned there's a couple of jerks out there as well, but I'm pretty good at ignoring them these days. But you can learn a ton just in the comments. This isn't like the greatest example, but this is an example. This is a post I had about configuring communication and firewalls between IT and OT. And you just a lot of the conversations, right? You can learn a lot from. So it's we just learn so much every day. So there's a lot of resources. Stay current on news. Just kind of as we start to wind down, I always just suggest at a minimum people read the Dragos Year in Review report. I mentioned Rob and Dragos earlier. Again, they are the shop for control system cybersecurity in the world, bar none. And they release their annual report. And every year, I mean, there's just so many fascinating details. And a lot goes kind of under the radar, which is really strange. Next Thursday, I'm going to do a webinar on kind of my take on like the highlights of the report, because there's a lot in there that a lot of people weren't thinking, like the alignment between state adversaries and hacktivists, right? They're starting to work together now, which is really concerning. Or that 40% of control system networks had active SSH connections to the outside world, which that doesn't necessarily mean they're compromised, but probably most of those are compromised. That's really concerning. Again, that was like Indrago's customers, and they work with the largest customer. They're not cheap, right? So they're not in smaller shops. I should say they are in some smaller shops because they give away all of their services to utilities in the U.S. and Canada if they're under 100 million in annual recurring revenue, which is amazing that they do that. So here's some new sites if you want. So a lot of, again, additional great resources. And we talk about, finding a mentor. I think everybody here probably has done that at some point in time, right? Relevant soft skills, and then certifications. Again, certifications, aren't as important or leveraged as much in the control system world as they are in the IT world. But there are a few paths. So the most common is the 62443 series that is sponsored by ISA. So this is usually where engineers will first go, and folks from IT cybersecurity as well. It's written for engineers. So when they talk about IT cybersecurity concepts, it's very basic. So for folks like myself, when I took these tests, it was I pretty much slept through the whole thing. I mean, it was really that kind of that basic for somebody with that background, right? Each test is basically half kind of IT cybersecurity basics, how they're applied in OT, and then information about 62443. So they have these 4 exams that you take. You have to take the 4 classes before you take the exams. And then this is the one thing I absolutely hate about it. And I've told many of the ISA folks this, that if you get all 4 certifications, they give you the cybersecurity expert certification, which like I take 4, and these are like 2-3 day classes, right? And again, these exams are super easy. And it's like, you're going to say I'm an expert. It just doesn't add up, right? It's a great start in learning, but you're not an expert in anything by, taking these courses and these exams. I hate to say. I mean, I wish I was. So the other path that's out there, and this is for people that have typically larger budgets, is that through SANS. And Rob Lee had actually designed the grid certification and course. He only teaches it once a year live at the SANS ICS Summit. I retook it with him last year, so he let me sit in. I originally took it with him in 2017, so that was really cool. I just took another class with them, but I got my master's through them, so I get half off. It makes it a lot nicer. The class I took doesn't actually have a certification, so it was just more knowledge based. But a lot of people go, GICSP is kind of like their entry level kind of general fundamentals of ICS cybersecurity. Rob's class grid, for me, that's the best class I've ever taken. Not just because of him, but it also takes the concepts of control system cybersecurity and breaks it down into a very practical, straightforward manner to implement. So it's, as he says, right, defense is doable, right? And he shows you that. Right, he helps you understand how to do that, how to make it happen. So, and then GCIP is for folks that fall under NERC regulations in North America. Right, that's regulations for power generation and power transmission. So, there are Exida. There's TÜV out there. I think they're both based out. TÜV is based out of Germany. Exida, I think, is also out of Europe, but they're very small numbers. So we have engineers at Fluor that have some of these certifications, for sure. I was going to work on. I think Exida has a SIS safety certification. I was going to work on, but yeah, you don't really see these from they're not popular cybersecurity certifications, we'll say. So just to wrap up real quickly, I did want to throw out just to talk about the top 5 ways to protect OT networks. And so it came up with this basic format. The idea that we start with backup and recovery, because I remember going into plants and environments, no matter how big, no matter how small. And because I range from, I think 3 million is the smallest environment I've been in, and 50 billion is the largest. So it's, when you go down, right, it's like, are you able to restore? How long is it going to take you to restore? Right? Are you able to restore that exact firmware version to that PLC? Right? Are you able to restore the logic? Right? Do you even have a spare PLC? Do you know where it is? Right? Those types of things. Right? Asset management, understanding what do we have in the environment to protect, because we need that information to do other things like design secure network architecture. Right? Do we have that firewall at least between IT and the control systems network, or multiple firewalls, right, in a DMZ configuration? And do we have additional segmentation within the control system network to, if anything, to slow down an attacker? I talk about, right, limiting the blast radius if something bad happened in one of those network sections. Incident response planning, right? Do we know and have we practiced what to do in the event that something bad happens, right? Can I go into the data center and pull the wire that'll drop the communication between IT and OT without causing any safety issues, right? Or availability issues? Right? Do we know how to do that? And do we know, would that cause safety issues or not? Right? A lot of environments, they don't have the answers to those questions. So if you don't know, no, you can't just unplug, right? And separate IT from OT if you don't know if it's going to cause safety issues or not. And then vulnerability management. Again, that's one of those areas where it's very different between IT and OT, right? IT, like this week was Microsoft Patch Tuesday. I know because all of my Windows machines rebooted at home and work, right? And then, but in the OT world, right, we don't just automatically start patching. We have to do a risk assessment, right? Kind of our almost like a HAZOP, right? To look, right, what is the real implication? And do we need to do anything about this? Or maybe we never will. Or okay, we'll schedule it for the next maintenance window in 3 years. So it's very different between IT and OT. But if you can nail those 5 things, you're already probably ahead of 90% of the environments out there. Right? You really want to go, and there's the first 5. You want a world-class control system network, you can do these first 10. Doing the risk assessment, doing the network security monitoring, which nobody does. About 5% of OT or control system networks globally do network security monitoring. I would say even half of those probably aren't doing a good job, because I go into some of those environments and they are not doing a good job. So I hate to say. So, and I have tons of resources. I think I have the slide here. Yeah, so you can, again, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out. There's my website. It just points you basically to LinkedIn and YouTube. And then on my GitHub page, I have a lot of the infographics, like here's the people to follow on LinkedIn. Here's the list of resources like conferences and podcasts and books and all those fun things to look out for. But yeah, other than that, so I appreciate the time. Any questions?